Welcome, everybody. We're going to be working on chapter 9 tonight. Our major topic for the evening is working on forms in HTML. Let's take a really quick look at the learning objectives here. And so we'll look at forms, how they work, the different things that go into forms, um, how to customize those forms and make them look nice. Um, we're going to look a little bit more at float and grid layouts. And then we're also going to look at some of the modern HTML5 form elements that were just added in like the last 10 years. We'll talk a little bit about um, what we call backend processing for a website, which is not something that's a topic of this class. But as you move into next semester, that's what you're going to start learning. Both using Node.js and PHP and Java, depending on which classes you're taking. And that backend programming is really important. We call that, typically server side processing as opposed to client side processing. But we'll also give you a free script where you can actually process your forms if you wish. All right. So let's take a look at what the heck is a form anyhow. And basically what a form is, it is probably, I would say, the most common way for a website to capture information from its user. And you see the little, diagram on the screen here where they have some boxes. The boxes are labeled, right? So the form is labeled shipping address, and then there's like a name, address 1, address 2, city, state, zip, country, right? Some of these are boxes that you click into and type. Some of them are boxes that have drop downs and you make a selection. And then once you fill out your form, you hit the button, and then some sort of magic website stuff happens, right? That we haven't learned how to do yet, but that's the server side processing, by the way, is like what happens when you click that button. So this is what a form looks like in HTML, and it is probably the most common way to capture information from a user, right? Something aside from a mouse click, like if you actually want them to type words on the page or enter a credit card number, forms are used for all of that kind of stuff. Logins as well. Right. So the grand tag that creates a form on a web page is called form, which is kind of convenient, right? And then inside of the form tag, so the form tag is kind of like an encapsulating tag. It's a container basically. When we want to add boxes to type into, those are called text boxes. If you want a little checkbox, well, those are called check boxes, right? And then you have buttons, and there's other things like the select boxes, sliders. There's also color pickers, date pickers, and all this like goofy stuff that you can utilize on your web page. All right. Generally, the way that a form operates is like this. We put a form on the screen in the form of HTML and CSS, and normally some JavaScript too usually comes into play as well. But we get that into the browser. So we deliver that to the browser, to the user. They come to our web server, they hit a page, the form comes up on their screen, right? So what we're going to learn tonight is how to build that form, the one that comes up on their screen. The other aspect of using a form is what we call the backend processing or the server side processing, which is what happens after you hit that submit button. And in truth, what happens is the form data gets captured, and then we send it back to the web server to be processed by a program that either we wrote or somebody else wrote. One of the real common languages that this happens with is a language called PHP, for example. Especially on most typical open source websites, they use typically PHP to process information. The PHP code runs on the server, it receives the information, and then it might do something silly like send it back to the screen, or take that information, send it into a database, right, to store it, or it might write it to a file of some sort, or it might take that information and use it for another process in the web application that you're using. So for example, if the HTML form is like log into the website with a username and password, so you type in your stuff and you hit the button, one of the things the server-side processing might do is get you logged into the site and then put a little thing up on the screen says, welcome, Joe. You know, we see you're signed in today, and the Packers lost, right? Or whatever, right? But the point is that that server-side processing can do a lot of different things, right? And they kind of highlight a bunch of the key ones here. So like when you take the data, you can send an email, write to a file, update a database, or some other type of processing on the server, just depending on what you're building or what kind of site it is, right? All right, so the first couple of tags that we're going to work with here, so I'm going to get into coding mode here in just a moment, are these two. And these two are probably the two key ones on a form, which is the form tag itself, which defines the fact that it is a form, and then the input tag, which is the one that will hold most of the types of interface controls that we typically use, most notably a checkbox or a button, or a box that we type words into. All right, so let's get into coding mode, and I'm going to begin here by doing file management, of course, right? That's where I always start. And I'm storing my stuff here on my Google Drive in my Prometheus account in my fall 24 folder. We're moving into unit 7. And to do that, I'm going to make a copy of unit 6. I'm going to paste it back into the same folder, and then I'm going to rename it as unit 7. That way I have a version, once again, of all my unit 6 work, and it's sitting there, and I'm not going to mess with it. It's untouched, so I can always have a fresh starting point for unit 7 if I need it. All of my work is in the project folder, and just to kind of review what the website looks like right now, it looks horrible, but whatever, you know, it's a kind of like an experimental page, really. But I have my silly home page here, an about page with the weird boxes, a blank gallery, a contact page, which might be very well suited for a form. In fact, this is where I will build my form. And then I have a whatever page, where we have to update the standings for the NFL or NFC North here, right? We have to increase some wins and increase some losses here. All right, so that's kind of the general lay of the land, but now my environment here is ready for code. I'm going to bring up my coding tool of choice. You can use whatever tool you want. I'm using Dreamweaver here this evening. And I'm just doing this mostly because I don't want to waste time going into a different IDE tonight. I will close my currently open work. I'm going to make sure that my unit 7 is coming up on the screen because that's the stuff that I want to edit. And I know I'm probably going to do all my work on my contact page. So that's the page that I'm opening. And just really quickly to review what it looks like currently. Pretty hideous, whatever. But the grander point is that I'm going to populate the main content area of this contact page with a form, right? And so why don't we just start really quickly before I do any of the tags from the PowerPoint and the chapter. Why don't I just set the page up to be ready, you know, to accept this? So this is going to be our contact page. And I think maybe what I'll just say here is contact form, right? And I'll just leave that as my title. And then, so since we're learning about forms, let's start by adding the form tag right away. So there's my opening and closing form tags. All right. I'm going to make a little bit of space around this kind of intentionally. I will be adding stuff as we go. But their general point here is that these are kind of the two basic tags of a form, the ones that are used most often. So the form tag itself, and then the input tag. And I want you to notice, like for most HTML tags, so I'll just demonstrate here. It's like if I type a paragraph and close it, notice how Dreamweaver automatically closes that tag for me. I'm not typing it. Visual Studio Code does the same thing, as do a lot of editors. But when I type the input tag, it didn't do that, right? So input the input tags, like meta tags, are ones that are technically self-closing. They don't need a closer. If you are working in an XHTML format, which is like the old school approach, you will sometimes see a closing slash inside the end of the tag. And you notice how Dreamweaver doesn't flag that as a mistake. So when would you use something like that? Kind of in the same scenarios where you would use, you know, a line break instead of like this. You know, if you're finding yourself doing this, and once again, this is the XHTML format, the one that preceded HTML5, but strangely is a format that is still used for application development, and a lot of applications won't work without it. So if you see a closing slash like that, my point is that's not abnormal. That's perfectly normal. And so you don't need to do one of these with input tags. It won't mark it as an error, right? Well, actually, it is marking it as an error. Yeah, but the input tag is self-closing. All right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint quick. And now that we've kind of got those concepts in our head, here's a couple of the other form elements that we're going to work with as well as we kind of move through the night here. It's not going to happen all at once, but we have the ability to have, for example, a text area, which is like, think of it as like the comments section of a contact form, you know, where you might type more than a couple of words. Like instead of just your name, you might type some sentences, right? So that would be a text area. And then we have the select and option boxes. And those are the ones where we have little drop downs, and they're pre-populated with items. And those two kind of work together. You know, so in other words, the select box creates the drop down list. The option are the items inside the select list. Right. Here's a quick little sample form, and we're going to kind of start mimicking this, by the way. But notice that we have basically the input tag, and then the input tag is populated with a number of attributes. And this is kind of an important little aspect of it. And you know what? I think it's probably easier for me to just go ahead and type it right into the code here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more. But inside that input tag, one of the key things that we must add here is what type of input is it? And you'll notice here I'm hovering in Dreamweaver because it's giving me all the possibilities that could go in here, right? So there's buttons, checkboxes, colors, date, date time, local, email, file, hidden, image, month, number, password, radio, range, reset, search, yada, 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 right? There's a whole bunch of them, right? And these are all valid in this spot. Some of them I think are pretty intuitive as to what you might use them for, right? We're going to start with text because that's the most fundamental. That's the kind of input that allows us to type into the box, basically. All right. Every time we create an input or any form element, there's this really weird convention that you do. Depending on what kind of thing you're typing into it, you need to name your form element and you need to give it an ID. All right. So this is kind of a very weird convention. This is kind of both to allow you to apply CSS to it and to use JavaScript with it at the same time, right? This is why we do this. So, for example, normally if I'm going to put an input box on the screen, I usually would like to tell the user what it's for, right? So I might, in front of it, just type email, right? And then I'm just going to go to the live view here just so you can see that it's already creating a box for us, right? Email in a box. And you know what? You can type in it, right? I can't do it here in my tool, but if I was in the browser, I could do it. Okay. Now, because we are intending for this box to grab somebody's email, we also need to name it to match what we're grabbing so that we know later when we grab the data what it's about. And so what you want to do, and what I recommend, is come up with a naming convention that's consistent. I tend to go all lowercase on these, or use the same kind of setup I might use for like a database column, right? So I always and this is the recommendation in forms, is that you make your name attribute and your ID attribute the same. This is kind of very weird, right? And I still sometimes struggle to wrap my head around it, because we know that an ID is a unique identifier for any object on the page. Because we're doing a form, every form element needs to be unique in order to really operate correctly. So that's where that convention comes from. It also allows for styling, right? The other part, the name, is actually the part that's used by JavaScript. So when we call upon that input object in JavaScript code to like do something with it, that's the name that applies. The general idea is to have those synchronous, right? I do see some people that change them. All right. But this is really kind of as simple as this. All right. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do some really basic formatting here. So I'm going to do, like, for example, some line breaks just to make stuff look better. And you don't have to do it like this, by the way. You can get fancier and make divs and boxes and whatever you want to do. That's on you. But I'm going to keep it super simple, at least to start with. The other element that we're going to add here is a submit button and a reset button. And I want to show you how weird this is, because you can do this also a couple different ways. So we're going to create an input of type submit. And we're going to create an input of type reset. Now, these are default control types, by the way. And really the way that they're going to appear is they are going to be on the same line here, unless I put in a line break. So I'm just going to do this with it, right? And very quickly, I'm going to save this, go back to the browser. Let's take a look, go into the contact page. And there's my super, super primitive, so far, email form. All right. Doesn't look very fancy, but all right, check it out. I can type in the box, right? I'm typing nonsense. I get it. And I can hit submit. Okay. Well, it disappeared. The page flashed. Really what happened is nothing happened. It just reloaded the page. I can also type stuff in the box and then hit reset, right? So reset automatically clears it. Submit will trigger the form to action depending on what action you decide, right? So that's kind of the general lay of the land. But you see how easy that is to get like the stuff up on the screen? Not too hard, right? And given the fact that I didn't style it or do anything fancy to it, it doesn't even look that bad. It's okay. Right. So that's kind of the general approach for creating input mechanisms for your page. So we have a really, really simple one to start with. We're following this format. Another thing that they've added in here, and this is one where this takes a little bit of thinking, is, are there boxes on the screen that they're filling out that are required? So for example, if my form was a form that was made to put somebody on a mail, like an email list or a newsletter list or something, we need their email address. So if they don't fill out the email address, then what's the point of filling out the form, right? You get where I'm going with that. So if you want something to be required, you can add this keyword in there. And I do want to show you, this is really weird, but like they have the alternate version is like this. You can say required equals required. Okay, that's really dumb. It really is. So you can just actually just say inside there, you can say required. All right, I'm gonna once again save this. I'm gonna go back to the browser and refresh, right? And then I'm gonna type something in. Okay, I'm gonna reset it like I'm an idiot and hit the wrong button. I'm gonna hit submit and watch what happens, right? So if they didn't type something in the box, that little required thing gives them this little warning. It says, please fill out this field. Pretty helpful, right? In other words, it's saying this is required and you need to fill it out. Otherwise, you're not getting past this point, right? Think about it. Like if you're doing a username and password to log into a website, I'd say both of those are required too, right? You're not going to log in if you don't type them in. So yeah, they are required. So you'll want to think about that when you have elements that you're putting on your form. Some stuff might be required, Some stuff might not. Right, so we've gotten this far. We've gotten 10 slides already. All right. So a couple things that are kind of interesting is the input tags will have like kind of like a, in some ways, a standard set of attributes that we add to them. So for example, and I'm just going to go back to kind of reinforce this, like you notice like here, I said input type text, and then I said name, email, ID, email, and required, right? Then I got lazy. Okay, real frankly, I did. I got lazy on these inputs. I might call this name, submit, ID, submit, and this would be considered good practice, by the way, is to do it like this. And then with the reset, you should technically do the same. So all the form elements, really, you should be doing this process. Now, the interesting thing about reset and submit, they are default types of form elements. So that's why they come up as a type. And the words that appear in the buttons are automatically placed there. The other thing that's really fascinating is, depending on what operating system you're using, whether you're Mac or PC or Linux, and depending on which browser you're using, right? You know, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, Opera, whatever, those buttons will look different. The words will always be the same, but aesthetically, they'll have a slightly different look on different operating systems. And it'll be whatever the default is for your browser and operating system. We can control these things by CSS, though, right? I'll teach you how to change the words on a button. It's really not that hard, by the way, but one step at a time. All right. So next thing that we're going to learn is that the form element, like the input tags, also has a bunch of attributes that we typically add to it. And I'm going to start with the name and the ID. So you see how those are at the bottom, but I'm just going to throw those in first just to get those out of the way because they're so common. Oh, let's just get to it, right? So here in the form tag at the top, I'm going to give it a name. And I'm just going to call it contact. And maybe we'll just call it contact form like that. And you know what? I'm going to keep it even simpler. I'm just going to call it contact. The ID, also contact. All right. Then they allude to two other attributes that are kind of important. And in one case, very easy to understand. In the other case, it gets a little bit more obscure to explain. I'm going to start first with the action tag. All right. So the action tag, attribute, action attribute, that gets added up here as well. We follow the same format, action equals double quotes. And then we will put something inside there. All right. What do we normally put inside the action attribute? Normally, this would be a link to the program or file or script that's going to process our form. So if there's a file on the server that might be called, for example, processform.php, I would call it here, and then I'll just type that in just to show you, like processform.php, right? It might look like that. So that would mean that I have a PHP file in my folder that's going to receive the form elements, bring them in as variables, run its programming logic, feed it into my database, write it to a file, put a message on the screen. I don't know what it's going to do, but it's going to do it, right? Now, we don't have this file, by the way. Okay, so we can't really do it. All right, but we could simulate that something's happening on the back end. And the way that we can simulate it is after the people hit submit, maybe we can take them to a different page. It says, hey, thank you for signing up for a newsletter. Prepare for spam or something like, goofy like that. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a page and just call it thank you.html. And basically, when they hit that submit button, it'll take us to that page. Now, here's a problem. Guess what? I don't have that page. All right. So that's a little bit of a problem. So why don't we duplicate our contact page? So I'm going to make a copy of my contact page, and then I'm going to paste it into the folder, and then I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it thank you.html. Right. And I'm going to go ahead and open that page. And I'm going to make sure I change my header on it and say, thank you. And then, whatever else you want to put up on screen. And I'm just going to keep it super simple. Um, and I know I'm being a little snarky here, but the point is, I just want to create a page that is indeed unique. I do have both pages saved right now. And so I'm going to reload the page with the form. I'm going to go ahead and, type in my email address here, and I'm going to hit submit. Right. So in truth, we are not processing the information. However, the user doesn't know any better, right? For all they know, we really have their information. But all I'm really doing is that button right now is just triggering me to go to another page. Normally, what would happen, once again, is I would probably send a person either to a PHP page or a Java page or a Python page or a JavaScript page that processes the information and gives you a thank you, right? It would do all of that. Right now, we're just doing thank you, right? So I just want to be clear on that. So we're simulating that the form is working. We're not actually making it work. I will show you a way to make it work later. If you want to do it that way, you're very free to do it. But for right now, the information's not really being captured, so why worry about it? I'm going to close that thank you page. That's about all we need of that. But we do want to keep adding more stuff here to the form. So let's kind of start breaking. Oh, wait, we didn't finish one really important thing. So, okay, so like returning here to the slide, we just added the action attribute, and this one will trigger whatever code will process the form. And remember, right now we're just going to that page, right? The other thing that's added here is called a method. And this is really weird. I'm going to start with the default, which is get. Okay. So if I don't write this in, right, by default, a form will do what we call a get. And I'm going to explain to you what a get is. So I'm going to use Google as my guinea pig here. So I'm just going to go to google.com, right, their search page, and I'm going to type, whatever and search it. All right. So when I type that in, I want you to take a really close look at the URL of the browser, which you probably never do, right? The URL of the browser up here starts with google.com search $Q equals whatever. So my search is in the URL. And then they have all this stuff. And this is tokenized, which basically attributes it to my account and whatever page I'm coming from and going to or whatever. This is all Google speak. I don't know what it is. But here's the interesting part of it. If you look at the beginning part of that URL, I can tell that I was at the google.com page. I triggered their search function, and my search query, right, using database terminology here, was whatever. And so when I fill out a form and hit a button, and then I can see the information in the URL, that's a get. That's what a get is. So when I say method get, that means whatever I'm typing in my form is delivered in plain text in the address bar of the browser. So if I used the Google search form to type in my password would appear up here in plain text. If I filled in my credit card number on a form using the the method of get, my credit card number would be revealed in the URL. This is really kind of an eye-opening thing, right? So, and this is the default. I want you to think about this is the default for forms. All right, so let's try this on our page here. So I'm just going to save this, go back to the browser for a moment, hit the contact page, and then I want you to watch what happens here. Typing in my nonsense text, and I hit submit, and I want you to look up here at the address bar. Basically, what this is showing me is that the thank you.html page, and then there's a question mark. The email, where's it getting that from? From the name I gave it, equals whatever I typed, and then I hit submit, which equals submit. So what it's showing you is that when I have my method set to get, or I don't even have it set, anything I type in my form will appear in plain text in the URL. Okay, maybe that's not a problem. It's not a credit card, right? It's not my social security number. It's not my password. It's not the secret recipe, like secret chocolate chip cookies or whatever, right? It's just words, right? So a get does not obscure the information that you type, will all be transported visibly in the URL. Now, if I switch this to post, which is considered the more secure approach, right? So I'm just going to save this. I'm switching it to post. I'm reloading my contact page. I'm just going to type in my nonsense text again and hit submit. And notice this time it took me there, but did not put that stuff in the URL. So here's kind of a functional difference. The get puts the stuff in the address bar and you can see it. A smart person who's looking to extract, like, what did this person type at the previous screen, can look in there and go, aha, that's what you typed. I can see it. It's right there, right? If I do the post, now it's hidden from the address bar, but here's the part that is the perplexing part. The stuff that's sent through the form, even with the post, even though it doesn't show in the URL, can still be intercepted as plain text in transit by a savvy hacker. So even that technically is not going to secure your credit card data. What it will do is it won't put it in the address bar. The only way to really secure a server, by the way, is to make sure that, basically the lock appears and that the connection is secure, which is by virtue of an HTTPS address. So it's got to post and have HTTPS, then the data is transmitted securely. If you don't have both of those pieces, you are in trouble, right? Because just a regular post can still be intercepted, and that is a little mind-boggling, right? It makes you uncomfortable, right? It's like, oh, so then how do I, is like the question you get, how do I, right? All right, so these are required. Gets the default, so if you don't mention it, that's automatic. More secure, post, and then we don't see it in the address bar, so usually when people are doing forms, this is the one that we recommend. Yeah, just long and short of it. All right, as we start getting into the input boxes, you'll notice that the different types of input boxes will have different types of features available to them as attributes. And we've done some of these already. Like we did type text, we did the name, the ID. We didn't do size, max length, and value though. So we should try all of those. All right, so let's try first, and we'll just do this on the input field for now, on the email field, excuse me. Or actually, why don't we do this? Why don't we make a couple of additional columns here, or a couple different additional entries? How about we do first name and last name? And because I want this all to look nice, I am doing carriage returns, a couple line breaks in between each one of these. This is just my preference to keep it looking nice. And first name and last name are also text. But I do want to change the name. So first name, I could do first name. And then my email, of course, would be the same. And then for last name, we can say last name. Do we want those to be required? Yeah, I guess. We'll make them required. All right. But let's take a look at like first name and add these extra attributes to it. So like one of them is size. And so I'm going to do something. I'm just going to put in a size of 50. And then I'm going to just have you guys take a quick look. So whatever the default is, right, here's the default look. Notice that these are set to default size. So last name and email are set to default size. I set this one to 50. So that tells me the default size is probably about 20. Now, does that correspond to characters?
No.
No, it does not correspond to characters. I don't know. It's not pixels. I don't know exactly what it's supposed to be. There's probably information on the internet about it, but you can see that you can make it really long. You can make it really short. And then like what if, for example, the person also had like a middle initial? So that might be a better example here. So why don't we do first, middle? Let's make middle not required because some people don't have middle names. And let's make the size of middle really small, right? So for example, maybe I'll make it like 5. All right. And let's save this, go take a look really quick. So refresh. So you see how that's a little bit smaller? I mean, it could be smaller, right? But does that mean I can only type 5 things? No, I can type as much stuff in there as I want. So what the size determines is the visual size of the box on the screen relative to what it normally is. It looks like the default setting for text is about 20, and this box is 5, and this box was 50. So go figure. I don't know what the thinking is. Now, do we think we need one that long for first name? I don't think so. So let's just bring that down to, I don't know, 30. Save it. Let's go back and look. All right. So first name's a little longer than middle, last name's kind of short, and maybe it should really be the other way around. So maybe the size of 30 should go on last name. This one can maybe go down to 4, and first name can go to 20. All right. And I'm just playing with them a little bit until I get them to kind of sit the way I want. All right. But that's the size attribute. There's that other weird one too, which is max length. This one determines how many characters you can type in. So how about this? If a person's typing in a middle initial, how many characters are you going to allow them? All right. Well, then you have to ask this question. How many people do you know that have more than one middle name? Do you know anybody that has more than one middle name?
I actually do. I know
Yeah,
two
I
people.
know a few actually. Right. And you know, one, it doesn't surprise me because I have like a lot of cousins, and yeah, they have like often like multi name middle names.
Yeah. That could have been their first name.
Yeah, yeah, basically. Yeah, that's a byproduct of being Greek, I think, at least partially. They got to like get every like saint name in there that they can, or something, or everybody's name Mary or Maria, right? Something like that. All right. Okay, so I'm going to set the max length of this, and I'm thinking that okay, I really just want people to put in a middle initial, like a single letter. All right, maybe they'll type an initial and a period, so I'm going to cap it at 2. All right, so watch what happens when I do this. I am refreshing. And when I go to that middle field now and I start typing, there's 1 letter, 2 letters, can't type anymore. So max length will actually cap it at a certain length. Right. So now you have to start asking yourself questions. It's like, well, how long should I make these? What should be the max length? And then often what we do is we don't set those. Real honestly, we don't set what the max length is. But if you're feeding this into a database, right? So if you guys make a correlation to the database class, if you're feeding this stuff into a database, it's a good idea to talk to your database people and go, okay, well, what kind of data type do you have on the first name field? What's your capacity on it? Do you have it set for like varchar 20, that kind of thing? And then you can set your max length on your fields here to match your database constraints so that when you're feeding the stuff into the database, it doesn't fail at the database level, right? Or get cut off if you don't want it cut off, right? So that's kind of the point of those. The other tag that they're having us try is value. So this is kind of an interesting one because what the value one does is it allows us to pre-populate some of the content, so watch. Right, so you see like I'm setting the value of last name to Smith. So when I go back to the browser here, if I can get to the darn browser, there we go. Smith is already in the box, right? So I can so for example, if the contact form was just for people in Wisconsin, I could, for example, pre-fill Wisconsin. Now, I don't know why I would want to do that in this situation. This is not really a good scenario for that, but it's possible to do that. So you can put the value attribute in and pre-populate a form. Now, the other use of the value attribute, and this is kind of interesting, is when you start to write programming code like JavaScript or PHP, for example, you can actually control that attribute with JavaScript, right? So, like if somebody filled out a form on one page and then they came to this page to fill out the form and they've already typed in their name and you know what their name is, you could pre-populate it, right? And you could inject it through the value, basically. Now, this is throwing a little bit of an error. Oh, yeah. Because I use the same ID and name, right? So all these names and IDs have to match amongst themselves, but must be unique from input to input, right? All right. So we looked at all those. Let's keep moving along here. Another kind of interesting input element is a text area. This one works a little bit differently, and this is one that gives us a larger box to type stuff into. So for example, I could add one here. So I'm going to do this right below email. First, I'm going to add some line breaks. And then right here, I'm going to create a text area. Now, unlike an input control, the text area does have an opener and a closer, right? It has some attributes that you can add to it. And I don't know if they have an example of, they don't even have an example of it, but we'll figure that out. But they do want us to put in the standard name and ID attributes, and then we'll play with rows and columns. So here inside the opening one, we'll say name. And I think I'm going to use this as a comments box. So I'll just call it comments. The ID will also be comments. Okay. Inside the tags is what you want your box to say before stuff gets typed in it. Something like that. Right, I'm going to save this, folks, and let's go back to the browser and look again. So here's my comments box. Okay, a couple of issues with it. I should have labeled it. I didn't do that, but I'm going to. But here's the box. It's pretty uneventful, right? It's pretty small. Doesn't even look like a comment box. I do want you to notice, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but whenever you see a box on the screen like this, and it's got those like little diagonal things in the corner, did you know you can click on those and make your box bigger? Right. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but by default, this is the size. To me, this is too small. So I got two issues that I'm seeing. The one issue is I want to label this. So I want to say comments colon, and then have the box. And I want the box to be bigger, right? All right. So a couple of attributes that we're going to add here. So the one would be rows. Okay, let's start with rows. And with rows, right now it looks like we have 2 rows. I'm going to say 10. All right, save and refresh. All right, well, that did nothing. Oh, because I said row, not rows. All right, shows you how picky it has to be. Right, and there's 10 rows. All right, I want more columns too. I don't know what the default columns are here, but I think it's about 20. So I'm going to say cols, C-O-L-S, equals, I don't know, I'm going with 50. Let's see what that looks like and see if that's appropriate. Refresh. All right, better, right? This looks like more like a comment box now. And then I want to label this too. And I'm going to start switching up how I'm doing my labeling, by the way. Comments. And then I'm going to put a line break after my labeling here. And I'll have you take a look at how that looks. Here's the refresh. All right. All right. Couple things we should talk about because this becomes an issue for some people. When we start to look at a form like this, right, and we're putting it together, and I'm hoping that you're starting to see like oh yeah, I could use this on my website too, blah blah blah, right? You come up with great ideas for it. But the way that it looks right now is a little, let's face it doesn't look great, right? It looks pretty basic. And there's some really basic formatting things that you can do to make it look good. So like the first thing that I notice as I'm doing this, right, and I'm like being critical of my own work here is, and I'm going to draw on my screen, is the fact that first name ends here and then the box starts there. And then this one starts here and there and here, right? That doesn't look great.
I was gonna ask you that, but I didn't want
Yeah.
to get to it. I know we would probably get down to it later down the line, but yeah, I was gonna ask you that.
Yeah, I mean, it is a thing, right? And as you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, wouldn't it look a whole lot better if that was all like lined up,
Just
like in a
lined up,
spreadsheet?
yeah.
Yeah, totally. And you know what? Think about this. You could create, and I'm just going to put this in your head as a possibility because we used to do this a lot. You could create an HTML table, right, where one column has your label and the other column has the box. And then all the labels would line up and all the boxes would line up and they would be perfectly symmetrical. That's one way to do it. Right. The author will show you even a different way to do it. And so a lot of us used to struggle with this a lot. So we'd sit there and make tables, we'd sit there and like do all this like weird CSS stuff to make it look all perfect and lined up. And then somebody smart came along and said, why do we need to do it that way at all? Okay, so my coercion here is don't worry about doing it like that. In fact, instead, think about maybe doing it like this. And basically what I'm doing is I'm putting a line break after each one of the labels so that the labels appear on a separate line than the input form. And I think that this is kind of real frankly, an easier way to not have to worry about that as a technique. So for example, right, first name, middle name, last name, and now the boxes are appearing below that, but they are lined up. Okay, so now, do you like this? Do you not like it? That's on you. I'm just telling you right now.
Not
Oh,
bad.
you. I mean, right. This isn't a bad approach.
Quick question for you though, now that we're on
Sure.
this actual topic. Is there a way to actually even know how like first name has more letters, like the way it looked prior, is there a way just to line up the boxes?
Yeah, and Juan, this is where you have to get creative, basically. So like that was kind of my point before when I was like doing the drawing is if you're drawing, right, I could, for example, first name fits in a content box of its own, but I could make that into a div. I could make that into a paragraph. I could make it into all sorts of little elements. And then I can figure out what width is big enough to hold the biggest word out of all these labels, right? And then make a bunch of little divs or boxes or whatever I want, however I want to do it, make them all the same size and just put different words into them. And then I could float these left and then create boxes to hold the input forms and float those right and put them in a container.
Just
You
doing
feel
way
where I'm
more
going with?
work. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, that's precisely where I'm leading you here, right?
Yeah.
That is a lot of work,
Yeah.
but a really nice looking form is a thing, right?
100%.
Like you can tell, like this is a really basic one, and it looks okay. It's functional, but it looks a little primitive, right? So you can create structures like this. And like I said, the author is going to show you a technique. But if you've thought about like other layouts that you've done like this, doesn't this all of a sudden look like a table? A table is actually not a bad mechanism for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's really easy to align stuff. Another way to do it is to use flex boxes or CSS grid, right? That works as well for doing this. And really, all of them will require a little bit of experimentation. But what I always recommend to students as well is go out to the web and take a look at other people's forms and how they do them and ask yourself, do you like it? This is kind of a weird thought, right? I guess I never thought about it like that. It's like, do you like the boxes that come up on the screen that you're typing into? I mean, look at Google's, right? Like they have a little search thing in there. The corners aren't square, they're round. There's little like icons in there and stuff. And, if I'm going to interface with any one of their screens to type in information, it's going to have like a certain look and feel to it. Take another example. What if I go to Facebook and I always like showing this one as an example, like, all right, and I'm doing this in my browser here where it's like pre-populating the content, but I'm going to strike that. And I'm doing this on purpose, right? So for example, when I land on the Facebook page, the first thing that I say to people is like, I'm not logged in. I land on their page. What are my options? Right. And the options are actually very few, right? They're coercing me to do what?
Email, password, login, and then or create a new account.
Right. And Juan, you hit it right on the head, right? You're either signing in or you're creating an account.
Hmm.
And it's really clear because it's right on the form. There's a big blue button, a big green button. I mean, all these are links down here too, but nobody cares, right? Then they have our profile icons for like me and my wife, whatever. So I don't have to type my stuff in, but my browser auto populates it, but whatever. But look at their form, right? This is kind of what I
Simple.
think of. Yeah, I mean, this is a nice looking form, and this is totally achievable the way that they're doing it too. So if you don't like the stuff to be labeled next to it or above it, here's another option. All right, so I'm going to show you this trick that you might choose to employ or not. Right.
In the actual
So
box.
yeah,
Yeah.
one you're well not I'm not making an actual box. I'm going to put the label for the box inside the
in the
box.
box. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's called a placeholder. So if you want the placeholder to say, for example, first name, I just add that as an attribute, save it, and then let's go back and look, refresh, and there you go.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'll be real frank. I like this better. I think that looks better than the other approach. Now I'm going to leave mine in there mixed like this, just so you can see the different approaches. But as I kind of move forward and towards the end of the session, I might decide to like try to make it look as good as I can. And then I'll just switch to one format or another. But I want you guys to see like the pathway to get there. Right. So that's kind of the placeholder approach. That's what Facebook is doing. Seems to be working for them, you know. And I think that is a good look. And the moment you click into the box to type, when you type, that stuff goes away. Right. So that works pretty well. I like that technique. I think it's very modern and fresh looking, real frankly. All right. Back over to this. All right. So we played with the columns and rows, right? We gave it a name and an ID. So that's a text area. We also have the submit button. So we've already played this or played with this one, right? So we've already done a button of type submit with a name and an ID. But let me show you how to change the text in the button, because maybe you don't want your button to say submit, right? So if that's the case, then you take the value attribute and you can say sign up for newsletter, for example. And, you know, see if that even looks okay, right? And you should always test your stuff and see what it looks like. And let's refresh. And is that what you want to do? Right. I mean, maybe it's a little less, you know, intimidating than a submit button, but submit's the default. Reset's also a default. One question that a lot of HTML people are asking these days is, do we even need a reset button, really? You know, some people are asking that question. So I would call that one optional, but the submit button does need to be there to trigger the form to action typically. We can style the buttons and the boxes and all of it a lot more, by the way. I'm not worried about it quite yet. Right, we'll get there. They also have the reset button, right? Like if you were to keep that, maybe you could change the text of it to be something like, for example, value equals clear form data. Something like that. Right. And if I had that button there, I would probably make that button really small and move it out of the way somewhere, and then make the sign up button like really big and green and bold, and, you know, make sure it gets their attention is really kind of the point. Right. I mean, take a look at the Facebook approach. Right. And notice they're using blue and green. Those are like positive colors generally. Like if it was red, you probably wouldn't want to click on it, you know, that type of thing. But we will learn to style those as we kind of keep moving forward here. So generally, I mean, we're kind of moving towards the structure here, and I think we've already gotten like this far, right? So we've already created a real basic form with name, email, some comments, and a submit and a reset button. All right. What kind of stuff might you also add to your form? Well, it really kind of depends, right? The next little like segment that we're going to do is we are going to experiment with a whole bunch of different form control types. I'm not saying that all of them will be relevant to whatever like project work you're doing, but I'm going to show you some of them so you can have it in your head that they're usable and that they're not that hard to use. It's just a matter of applying them. Why don't we do a break first, though, because we've been going for a good hour here. So let's come back at about 5:43, you guys. So I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes or so. All right, we're back from break and we're going to work on the next little input control here. And this is kind of a weird one to put next, in my opinion, but I'm following the author's stream here, so don't shoot me because I think this is kind of a more advanced form element. But what if like you wanted to put on your website a way for somebody to upload a file, right? Maybe a picture or a document or whatever, right? Whatever that might happen to be. So we can do that with an input control. That's allowable. You basically switch the type to file. However, right, you do have some prerequisites. The one prerequisite is in your form element, you must include the method post. So in other words, you can't send a file with a get, right? So you have to put that in. The other thing that's preferred to do, you'll see examples online where this is not included, but if you really want to send that file, you also have to include an encoding type multi-part form data, and that should be also in your form element. So if you want to copy this in, and I'm not sure if it's smart to copy it from here, you know what, I'll just go back to Dreamweaver and type it in directly. So I'm going to add here what are we encoding type, right? So I've already forgot what it was. Encoding type, and right here, multi-part form data, and I'm just using the defaults here. So this is something that you're supposed to add, right? Once again, we're not actually processing our form, but if we were, right, this you would add this. So maybe you'd give people a chance to do that. Maybe you want them to upload a file, maybe their photograph or something goofy like that. So we could just borrow one of these input elements here, and I'm going to drop it in. I'm going to call it, I don't know, upload your file, something like that. And the type will be switched to file. And you know what? Let's name it that too. We'll name it file and file, right? This will not be required, right? Because maybe they don't have a file to upload. There's a couple of other attributes that people throw in here. So like, I'm just going to go back to this just so you can see it on the next slide. So for example, the name and the ID are still required. And then there's also what we call accepts, right? And this is, in other words, what file formats are we accepting? So in other words, are you gonna take JPEGs? Are you gonna take PNGs? You're taking PDFs? You're taking docs? Whatever. Also, the capture thing, which allows for, if I'm not mistaken, for drag and drop to work, so you can drag stuff in here. That takes JavaScript and stuff though, so we're going to leave that off the table for right now. And then multiple, which allows you basically to declare the fact that you can upload more than one file at a time. So this is kind of a strategy thing. I'm just going to operate it without these three attributes right now because what we're doing is just very much a demonstration, and we're not really worried about actually uploading a file. If that is really a concern of you for whatever website you're doing, there's a lot more that you're going to have to do aside from this. These are the basic attributes you would use. But you still need to have a place for that file to go. So you'd have to set it up so that your backend code has the ability to accept the file, probably virus scan it, and then save it to your file system. So this gets like into some pretty touchy areas, and therefore really is an advanced skill on the back end side. But on the front end side, it's really easy to add the form element. So that's what we're doing here. I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to load it back up in the browser, and let's just take a look at what it looks like. If I find the right browser window, that is. All right, so let's refresh. All right, so like upload your file. See, we got the little choose file icon there, right? Did you guys notice I didn't put that in, right? The input control put that in for us. And then once I hit the thing, it brings up the standard system dialog. I'm just going to attach a PowerPoint file. It shows me which one's attached. And then you can send it. Now, of course, all right, well, I have some required fields here. All right, so some of these are required. I think email is required too. But it would send, right? So like if you had the mechanism on the back end to receive it, that page would actually send the file. So notice, not very hard to do, right? To create the mechanism to grab the file, because the truth is we're invoking the one from the system, right? We're not creating this box, right? Windows is doing this for us. But this is a really helpful one to know, especially if you have this very specific need. Of course, there's engineering that happens on the back end. So you still have to have back end code that takes the file and processes it, which even if it's just stored on the server, right? But that PHP file or JavaScript file or whatever it is has to have read write permissions on the server for that to happen. So we kind of go into some much deeper topics there, which is why we're moving on right now. All right. Some other types that are kind of interesting, right? So like maybe you want your person to create maybe a username and password. How about this for a concept, right? So why don't I do that down here? I'll just kind of create like some dummy fields down here at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to borrow a couple from here and then like tweak them, right? I just don't want to type all that stuff over and over again, basically. All right. So here I will say username. And that will just be plain text, right? And a username, usually we don't worry about securing that. I'm not going to say it's required, and I'm not going to pre-populate a value, right? I'm getting rid of that stuff. And then here for password, this is where we're going to switch the type to password. And you'll see what this does in just a moment. And basically what it does is it allows you to type into the box, but as you're typing, right? So you see like username is like my username, right? Whatever. But when I go to password and I start typing, it obscures my letters. Right. That happens just by making it type password. Pretty slick, right? Kind of a slick little feature. All right, so we're gonna use that as an example. A couple of other little features that we're going to look at are next are basically the radio button and the checkbox. And these have kind of a specific type of usage, right? And so what I'm going to do here with these is just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to copy and paste some in, and I'm going to use it to kind of teach you a couple of concepts here, which I think are kind of interesting. So, all right. And I'm trying to think of like, where's the most efficient way to place the copy it from. And I think I might maybe copy some of my old work here as opposed to copying something off like maybe W3 Schools or something. So just bear with me here just for a moment. All right, so all right, here's my example, and I am doing this in a hurry up fashion, so please be mindful of that. That I'm not doing it to cheat you on content here. I'm doing it to just kind of speed things up a little bit. All right. So here's the code that I'm dropping in. So I'm just dropping in some text, and I'm saying choose the browsers you have tried, select all that applies. So that's just regular HTML. Then I create a series of input controls, right? Notice that I'm giving each one a name and an ID that match. So I have Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Opera, Brave, Internet Explorer, funny. And the one I forgot is probably Safari, but whatever. Okay, so those are the ones I have on there. And then notice that each one of these is of type checkbox, right? And then each one of them also includes a value, right? That's unique. Usually the value will match up with the name or the ID, right? I'm going to add one more checkbox here for Safari just to show you how easy it is to add one. So we'll just call it Safari since we overlooked it basically. All right. And then we should change it here as well. And say that. Let's take a really quick look at what the form looks like. And then I will talk about the features of checkboxes, which make them kind of interesting. So this is what a checkbox looks like, you guys. And notice that you see these on web pages all the time, right? And the way that a checkbox works is with a checkbox, you can choose more than one item. And I put like, apparently I have Safari in here twice. I didn't see it above. I'm not really sure why, but whatever. The cool thing about a checkbox is I can submit multiple items, right? And even the instructions say select all that apply. And I could select none, I could select two, I could select five, whatever. I can do that, right? So that's a checkbox, right? And I guess since I didn't see Safari in there, and I'm looking at it right now, and I don't. Am I like weird, or am I not seeing Safari in here twice? Oh, I see. Yeah, it's down here. All right, whatever. I'm getting rid of it. All right, so that's a checkbox, right? So type checkbox. There's another one that's kind of similar, and if it helps you to kind of see these better, if you kind of spread them apart like this, please do that. So I'm going to do that for the radio buttons. Radio buttons are very, very similar to checkboxes in terms of how we sort of put them together. So you notice once again, here the type is set to radio, and then that will give us basically what looks like a checkbox, but it'll be a round circle instead. We still give it a name and an ID. This is where this gets a little weird. So notice all of them share the same name, and this is required for a radio button because this is what gives it its exclusivity, basically. And then the IDs are all different because they have to be, but the names are shared. But the values are indicative of which browser you're using. So the idea of this one is, which is your favorite browser, is the point of this little entry. All right, saving back to the browser to see what it looks like. And so here's some radio buttons. Now, watch the difference between a checkbox where I can select multiples, right? Or the radio where only one can be selected, right? So you see why that's different. I cannot select multiples here no matter what I do. The reason it disallows that is because all of them have the same name. If they did not, if these were all unique names, then that wouldn't work, by the way. So if you want your radio buttons to work that way, you got to make sure that they're set up that way. And I would suggest that you do want them to work that way. All right. So there we are with checkboxes and radio buttons. Right. And I'll do a refresher and make a little more space around it. All right. So we did our checkboxes. We did our radio buttons. We can also apply, if we want like a certain box to be pre-checked, we can add that to it so it can be checked in advance. So I'm not sure if you really want to do that. Here's another kind of really strange one that you can do hidden ones. All right. So like whenever I try to explain this one, especially if you're brand new to doing HTML, it's like, all right, so you're going to create a form element, but it's going to be hidden. Like, why would you do that? All right, well, there are reasons for this. So I'm just going to give you a really quick little example here. And I used to do this a lot when I would code e-commerce systems, for example, because if I was like getting a product in a shopping cart and somebody was about to check out with them, in order to calculate the shipping correctly, I would also need to know like the weight of what that item is before I put it like in a UPS box or something, right? Because that determines the shipping cost. And so I would often create form elements like this, like input, type, hidden. And then, of course, yeah, I have to give it a name. And I might call it like ship weight. Type it. And then I would also create an ID with the same name. And then the value, if this is like one singular product in like an e-commerce system, I might know the weight is 1.75 pounds or something. And I would just type that in, right? And then the only purpose of this, right? So watch on the front end, it's not visible, it's hidden, right? That's supposed to be hidden. It is there. Its only purpose is in the background to transmit that value back to the application for calculating shipping correctly. That's its only purpose, right? And so this is a little technique that programmers use on web pages to hide information they're moving around, right, through a form, right? So that's the hidden form field. Uh, the next one that's kind of interesting is this select list. So I'm gonna like cover these next 3 slides and then I'll do the demo on it. But basically, this is what we call a couple different things. I always think of it as a drop-down box, right? That's what I think of. However, some people call it select box, drop-down list, drop-down box, or option box. All of those are valid. The tag for this is select, right? So we'll see that in action in just a moment. Here are some of the attributes that we are allowed to add. So name and ID, those are standard. We can also select the size so that like the drop-down box width can be controlled. We can also set the multiple options so that somebody can, if we can, the default is they only select one, but if I allow for multiple, they can select multiple things from the list if you wish, with like a control click, that type of thing. So the select sets up the structure for the drop down, and then the options are the items inside the drop down that are individually detailed. So for example, if I have like a drop down list of like which car do you own from this list, I would put the individual cars in the options, right? So let's kind of do this now code wise. So I'm going to begin by finding a spot to put it, and I'll do it right here under the hidden tag. Nobody can see that one anyhow, right? I will add, first of all, this statement here. So I'm putting in a select tag and I'm closing it if I can. All right, there we go. Now it's closed. All right. Inside the select tag, right, and you can see I'm the question's going to be basically, this is basically going to be the question. And I put that right above here. Choose a car. Putting in a line break. That's kind of what it's going to say. And now we're going to give them all the options. So I'm going to just paste in all the options on the screen here that I have ready to go. So these are the options that I did last time. So I'm just copying my work from last time. That is true. All right. And so the select box will basically be an ID and a name of cars, right? Because we're choosing a car. I'm making it size 3. All right. And the size isn't necessarily what you think. Size 3 means it's not 3 characters across or 3 columns across. It's actually how many in the drop down list you can see all at once. And I think what I'm going to do here is, for now, and actually let me control Z that. I'm just going to remove these 2 attributes just so you can see how it looks without. The drop down list itself will contain Volvo, Saab, Opel, and Audi, right? And you'll notice that I have a selected thing in there automatically. So it's going to pre-select the Audi for us, right? Even if you don't want that to happen. But that's what I decided to do here. All right, so here comes the refresh. And notice how Audi is pre-chosen. If I hit the drop down, you see all the different cars and you can select the one you want. If I remove the selected, the top one in the list would be the one that appears, right? So just to show you that, here's the refresh, right? So it goes right to Volvo. All right. I'm going to switch it back though. I'm just going to Control Z that. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste in the size equals 3 feature and then watch what it does to the drop down. So it shows you 3 of the things in the list at once. That's, you know, what the setting does. The multiple also allows me to click more than one, right? So I can hold down my control key and click more than one object. So that's a select box. Which way you think looks best? I'm not sure I'm crazy about the size thing so much, but let's get rid of multiple too. And I tend to like this look best, right? And I'm seeing here that if I put multiple in, it like expands the box, you know, to show all the choices. So, you know, you're going to have to play with that one a little bit, you know, to get it to go the way you want it. So I'm going to do like maybe size equals 2 or something like that. All right. So that's a select option box, you guys. All right. Now, with some of the next things coming up, some of these things I'm just telling you up front here. I'm going to demonstrate some stuff. I'm not going to demonstrate other stuff. I'm looking at the clock. Time's going really, really fast here, so just keep that in mind. If you wish, right, like if you're putting a form together and you hate the way the buttons look, you can replace the buttons with images. So you can actually put an image in the button. All you have to really do is basically tell it what type it is, which is an image, and then you'd have to declare the source for that image, right? But it's a way to get like a really particular looking button in there. I'm not a huge fan of doing that these days, but in the old days, I was very guilty of using that technique a lot, right? Now, the other thing that we've been kind of working with is the submit button, right? We did submit and a reset button that are part of our form and they're way at the bottom of the form. And we're like just kind of utilizing it. We didn't like tell it really it was a button, but that's what it turns out to be when you put it on the page. But those two are directly inside the form. And when you say it's type submit and type reset, the form code understands that it's of those types and that a submit and a reset are buttons. And that's what you should display on the screen. However, right, you can also just create standalone buttons, right? So I can just create a button that's not in a form and then have that button do stuff. That's totally a thing. And of course, I'll be snarky and create a a whatever button. But the point is you can kind of put buttons wherever you want. They don't have to be inside of a form. Even it's probably a better idea to do that. Now, if you are building a form, so this is a weird question. Why do they have these input tags and then they have a button thing, which makes more sense to use for these, right? This is the newer tag. So this came out with HTML5. This didn't pre-exist prior to HTML5. And it was frankly a challenge to put buttons on the screen prior to that. And you would have to use those input types to kind of make it happen. I can, instead of using an input type submit, use a button and then make it do the submit action. That is totally doable. But for right now, as you look at this button down here, the whatever button is just a standalone button, right? And when you learn to do back end coding, by the way, you can throw buttons on a page and then attach a piece of code to them, and then when you hit them, they do stuff, right? That's totally a thing, right? So for now, I'm just showing you how that you can make a button, right? That's the grand goal of that. All right, when clicked, its function depends on the value of the type attribute. So like if we wanted it to be submit, I would still have to say type submit, right? Or reset or whatever. You can put words in the buttons, you can put images in the button, you can even put videos in the button, by the way, if you really wanted to. The types that you might set for a button are usually one of these three, right? So if it's type submit, it will perform, you put it inside the form and it can replace your submit button. If it's a type reset, same thing. If it's a type button, it doesn't even have to be in the form, right? That's where it gets a little bit weird. But I just want you guys to know that that's kind of a thing. Another thing that we start to look at is this concept of accessibility. And these are some like high level stuff. I will demonstrate a few of these, by the way, but not all of them. Probably the most important one here is really the very first one, which is the label element. So let's take a look at that one real quick. So far as we've been typing our input controls, and I'll just go like email, which is where we started. We were typing just in plain text. It's not even in a tag, right? Which is really, frankly, considered not good HTML, by the way. But it's just sitting there, text just sitting there. But clearly, it's labeling this input box, right? And the technique of using labels or the label tag fits one of two formats, right? And so you can do it one of these two ways. You can take a label tag and wrap it along with the text around the input tag and close the label tag on the outside of email, right? And that way, this name becomes attributed to this input, right? Because they're part of the same structure. So let me just demonstrate this approach really quick here. And I'll do that right here on the email thing. So I'm just going to say label like so. I'm going to take the closing label, cut it, and I'm going to put it at the end of the input like so, right? So that's one way to do a label, right? The other way to do a label, and I'll do that with the last name field, is you can say label, then you include the attribute of for. What is this label for? And I'm going to say last name. It's got to match either the name or the ID. And then I'm going to put the closing label tag here, right? So just the last name is contained, but we add the attribute so that we know which input control it matches up with, right? So those are the two different approaches for doing labels. Now, the one advantage of putting all of your labels in a label tag is now it's in a tag and I can style it. You see, that's kind of the thinking, right? If all my labels are all in a label structure, then with one command, I can change their font or change their color or whatever, right? Their formatting, that's kind of a thing. All right. The next thing that we're going to look at is this concept of a field set and legend. And we're going to look at first what this looks like on the screen, frankly, right? So this is what it does. If I create a field set, it will put a line around a portion of my input elements. If I put a legend on my field set, it gives it a label like this, right? So if you like this look or have a functional purpose for it, I would say use it. Here's the code for accomplishing it, right? So use the field set tag. The legend, once again, is the text that appears in the line, right? That's the legend. And then you just create a regular input type like you normally would, like your stuff that goes inside your form, and then you close it, and the closing field set element will put that box around it. So when you have really, really complex forms that have different sections, you might want to use this. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the look. I think it looks very 1990s or something. So I shy away from this, right? But it's there if you want to do it. Another really weird thing is this concept of a tab index. And this is where we can control how a user can move around the screen with a tab key. All right, so this is really kind of a deep rabbit hole too. But there's an era of computing that kind of came before our GUI operating systems, like before Windows was around, before the Mac OS was around. And when we would be on a screen navigating a screen and you didn't have a mouse, how on earth did you move around the screen? Right. Well, you might think, like, oh, arrow keys, obviously, right? But another way to actually move around was with your tab key, which is what this is sort of addressing. The way I'm going to demonstrate this is I'm going to actually go to my contact form page, right? So you can see it's like loaded up here and beautifully ugly, and it's all its glory. And as I'm sitting here on the page, and I'm going to do a refresh here just to make sure it's fresh. I want you to watch what happens on the screen. I'm going to start pressing my tab key on the keyboard, and every time I press it, I'll say that I'm, tab, tab, tab. I'll say that, and then I want you to watch what happens on the screen as I press my tab key. Right. So here's my first tab. What did it do? It highlighted the first link on the page. Tab, 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 tab. Right. So I'm navigating all the possible things on the screen that I can interact with automatically, top to bottom through my code, by just pressing the tab key. So anything I can interact with, and I'm tabbing right now, moves me down my form and through my page, right? And if I want to like for example, check that box, I can hit my space key, right? And I hit my space key, and I can navigate the entire form this way. This is kind of interesting. Now, the order in which the tab key navigates your form or your page is determined by the order of your code. But here's what happens sometimes. Sometimes the order of your code is not the order that you want the person to traverse your form with, right? So if that's a concern, they have a mechanism called the tab index that you can add as an attribute to your things, and you can number your form elements so that when a person is pressing tab, like I was just doing, it will determine the order in which the tabs move you around the screen. Pretty weird, right? Another one I don't really use a lot, but a lot of people don't know you can do this, right? So if you weren't aware of that, right? So like you can go to any web page and you can tab around the screen, like I'm doing right now, to move around, right? So if you ever think your mouse breaks, your battery in your mouse dies or something like that, and you're on a web page and you still need to move around, well, press your tab key, by the way. All right. The next kind of weird one is this access key attribute. And this is another one of these that rarely used, but I do feel compelled to talk about it. If you apply this attribute, which is access key, and I want you to notice capital E, right? You can basically assign hotkeys to the keyboard so that when people are using your web page or web app, they can use control plus a letter to do certain actions, or like fill out a form or trigger a button or whatever, right? That's totally a thing. Once again, I don't use this a lot. I'm not really a fan of it. You will notice, for example, though, like if you ever use like Google Docs, right? Like when you're inside there, you can do Control Z and Control C and Control V, and like cut, copy, paste, and all that stuff, because it's coded into the web application, right? You also have to be careful in the browser when you're doing hotkeys that you're not choosing hotkeys that are already assigned to something else. Like for example, refresh is Control R. So you don't want to make your R key an access key. It doesn't make sense, right? Or Control S would save, or Control P would print, or Control Z, X, C, V, and Y all are redo, undo, cut, copy, paste, right? So you don't want to use any of those. Those are, like some things you rule out. All right. Once again, I find this to be a limited usage for most regular programming, but you do see web applications that do apply this, so it's good to know. All right. Now let's get to this concept of like, okay, what if you want your form to actually like look good? You know, this is kind of an issue. And we're looking at this before. So remember when I started out, I had my labels to the left and my boxes to the right. And then as soon as like you do first name, middle, last name, and then you got like zip, you know, the labels are of various lengths, but you kind of want to achieve this look, right? Where things are all lined up. So they give you an example here where all the labels, for example, are floating left, right? They display as a block and they're set to a specific size. So this is a way to get them all to line up. And then for the form, we're making it a certain width and all that because the labels are floating left, the text boxes are filling in the space right next to them, you know, for example, and that's why they line up. So that's one approach to do it, right? So you can use floats and regular box construction and floating techniques and stuff to get it all in place, right? So here's some of that CSS continued, right? So like if you really want to copy this approach, there's code here. You can use this approach and you can make your forms line up really nice like that. The other thing that they're doing that I think is kind of neat here is they're right aligning the labels. So these are aligning on the right edge. The boxes are aligning on the left edge. What we used to do, real frankly, in the old days to make this happen, is we would just make a table, right? And we'd put the labels in one column, the text boxes and the inputs in another column. All the inputs were left aligned, all the labels were right aligned, and it looked great, right? So I think that this actually might be a more challenging way to do it, real frankly, than putting it in a table. But here's one way. So you can use CSS to style it. You could use a table, right? Or another approach is using that technology we looked at, I think like 2 weeks ago now, called CSS Grid. So they give you once again what CSS styles you would apply to your form element to create the grid that you see here. So they give you the exact CSS code, and then they show you what that would look like. And you know, if aligning it is really that critical to you, it would behoove you to try one of these techniques. I'm not going to spend the time on demonstrating all of them because I could do like a half hour on each one, and I really don't want to do that. But if you have this issue, if this is an issue for you, you don't like the look of the default, then you'll experiment with these. The CSS grid approach is slightly, let's call it unusual, right? It's probably the one I would be the last one I go to, but it is also the most modern one, so it's probably the most correct one to go to. But they give you the code here, so if you want to try it and mimic it, feel free to try it and mimic it. All right, so 3 different ways: regular CSS with floats, a table, or you could use CSS grid. Or there's option number 4, which is don't worry about any of that and do the stuff I'm about to do to it in a little bit, right? Which I'm just going to keep it in kind of my more basic format, and then I'm going to narrow it up, put it in the middle of the screen, and I think you'll probably agree it looks okay. All right. All right. So any one of those approaches. All right. So you're doing these forms, and you get to this point where you have that action attribute at the top, and you're starting to get this wheel turning in the back of your head. It's like, oh, so I can put stuff in a form, and then I could actually do something with that information. Yeah, but that does come later. So we call that generally server-side processing, where if it's happening in the client's browser, we call that client-side processing. So that would be CSS, JavaScript, and HTML working together. On the server, it works a little bit differently. So basically what the server does is you're sitting at your browser, you send a request to the server for a web page, and the server sends something back, right? Now, when we process a form and hit submit, the same kind of thing is happening, but the browser request is in the action tag, and we're taking the form data and we're sending it to wherever that action tag is set up to receive it, right? And then ideally we'd get some sort of response to know that it worked. What kind of languages can you use to do server-side scripting? Probably the most popular one out in use today is PHP, right? And most of the world's websites use that technology on the back end. Cold Fusion from Adobe, this is ancient stuff. I don't know why it's still in the PowerPoint, so I would just put a strike through on that one. At this point, I think it still exists, but I don't think anybody's using it anymore. There are some old legacy Java pages out there. JSP is not the only format for Java. There's also Java server faces and servlets, which all work a little bit differently. And then you have ASP.NET, which is another technology that you learn in a program. Some of the stuff they're ignoring here. So we do have like PHP, Java, and .NET, which is basically C# and Microsoft stuff. But there's also the possibility of doing server-side scripting with Node.js, which is a form of JavaScript. You can also do server-side processing with other programming languages, like, for example, Python, right? And Python is being used more and more these days to do server-side scripting for websites. The general lay of the land, though, is that the web page processes a form and sends the information off to that script or whatever on the server. The server runs the script, whatever it's meant to do, put it in the database, put it on the screen, whatever the task is. Once that's done and it does the task, then it sends back information to the screen to basically let the user know, hey, it worked. Like, thank you for signing up for our newsletter, right? The appearance is that it worked. We know it didn't, but right, that's kind of the thought of it. Or if for some reason it didn't work, maybe you might want to ask your user to re-enter the information, or that failed, try again, or something to that effect, right? But the important concept of this, though, really is that the real work of the form actually happens on the server, and the users have no control over that. It's out of their hands, right? The programmers, us, we do have control over it. What do you use server-side scripting for? Here's common stuff. You can search a database, put an order in online, send a web page to a friend, subscribe to a newsletter, or upload a file, or what have you, right? You can do all those different types of goofy things. If you wanted to set up your form, for example, to actually behave like it's processing, the author of our book has a free script here you can attach to. So if you copy this URL, right, and I want you to notice there's an extra space here, and I'll put this in the chat if you guys want. So let me just drop that in the chat here really quick. Well, if you go directly to that page, it's not going to do anything, right? But if we put that link in the action tag of our form, and I'm going to do this temporarily, and so you have this option for any of your form homework, by the way. So I'm putting that in, and I want you to notice this is going to somebody else's server, but it is running a PHP file, right? What that PHP file does, we don't really know, but we're about to find out, right? So here goes. Back over to the browser, we're refreshing. All right, and I'm going to start like typing in some stuff here. I'm not going to upload a file, username, password. We'll do some clicking in there, right? And here I go, signing up for the newsletter. And notice what it did, right? So what this action does is it sends it to the author's server. It reads all the forms or form information and then puts it back up on the screen. That's what that PHP file does. This is really basic, but it does show you that the information made it somewhere. It traveled across the internet, and then that demo PHP file sent it back to us.
So are we able to upload it to the Prometheus server? Like once we have it working, that information, if it gets filled out, are we able to get it sent to the Prometheus server?
Yeah, I mean, you can still upload your pages there, Juan. What won't happen is like this information isn't really getting stored anywhere.
Okay.
This is just bouncing back from a different server, is really what's happening.
Yeah.
When you get to that PHP class, if you want to really write it into a database, you can. Right.
Perfect.
So none of this will confuse or break Prometheus in any way, but that's a good question. Now, what I will say is I'm not going to use that, and I'm just going to put a little comment in here. Right. So this is the alternative action. And actually, why don't I copy the whole action tag here? And I'm just going to drop it in here. And that way you can, see it. I am going to go back to using my goofy thank you page though. So I'm just going to go thank you.html. That's my choice, right? If you want to use the author's action, that's fine. Either one is okay by me. With the author though, this is what you're going to get, right? This is exactly what it's going to look like. You have no control over styling it because it's not your page, it's the author's page. I think it's kind of nice though, because at least you can see some server side processing happening. There's a lot of different places that you can go on the internet. They're recommending some free services. Not a fan, by the way. I don't like any of these services. The authors is probably the best one. If you're interested about learning about some of these, server side technologies, JSP, like I said, all the Java stuff you will learn in your Java 2 class. PHP, we have dedicated classes on that. .NET, you will learn inside your ASP.NET class. Cold Fusion's kind of a dead technology. Ruby on Rails is one that was really popular, I'm going to say about 10 years ago or so. We actually used to teach it here at Gateway, but we have now retired that. There still are websites that are built on that technology, though. Just a different programming language, very Python-like, by the way. All right. What I'm going to do with this last little section of class here, because we are running out of time super, super fast, but I think I can get through the rest of the slides, is to talk about some of the other input types here. I am not going to demonstrate them. I'm just going to talk about them, and because we only have minutes left here. So the first thing I'm looking at is there's also an input of type email. There's a typo there, by the way. And then what happens with that, and we already have an email box on our form, so you might want to think about switching the type, is when you enter in the information, if you've got the type set to email, it will actually check to see if it's a correct email address, right? So it'll look for the @, it'll look for like .com or whatever. And so I think that's a pretty handy one. So if you want to make sure that somebody's typing in an email, switch your type to email. You can also set one to be of type telephone. And this is kind of interesting, especially if you're feeding that into a database. This can be a pretty helpful one. There's also an input type for search box. And basically what that one does is it creates a regular looking box, but it adds a magnifying glass in the box to show you that it's like a search box, so it looks a little bit different than a regular input box. All right. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. It's close to a select option box, but this one's called a data list control. Take a look at the syntax for this. We have a label, right? We have an input box for colors, right? And I want you to notice here that instead of a value attribute, it has a list. And then there is a data list that would pop up in the box. So basically what happens with this is you put in all your options, and as the person starts typing in the box, it will present these options as they're typing. So if you ever go to a website, it's like, how do they know what I was about to type? Right? Well, it's on a list. That's why. you know. And so this is a really nice little example. And you know what? You can just actually take this code as it sits right here and paste it into your thing if you want to play with this. This is, you know, I mean, the code's right there, right? Just copy paste it into yours and try it. Another one that's kind of new to HTML5 is what we call a slider control. And you see this on web pages now too. So you can set up a little slider like this, and you can also set what the minimum and maximum ranges are. So if they slide it all the way over to low, it's going to give you a value of 1. If they slide it all the way over to high, it's going to give you a value of 100. Those numbers are arbitrary. You can make them whatever you want. It can go from 1 to 10 or 3 to 5, or it doesn't matter, right? You control that. That's a slider. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. They call this a spinner control. And that's kind of like a drop down list, right? But it's got a little up and down arrow. And I do think it works probably best for numbers or things kind of like numbers, right? So that's a spinner control. Here's kind of a neat one. I think this one's pretty blow away actually, because in the past we used to have to teach people how to write JavaScript, and then we'd teach them jQuery, and then we teach them the jQuery mobile libraries and all this like goofy stuff just to get people to get a calendar up on the screen like this. But it's super easy. You can just do an input type date, you know, and this one I can demonstrate super fast because I think this one's pretty neat. Right. And with all of these, since they're providing the code, you can do what I'm doing, right? You can just copy the control, go to your coding engine and just drop it in and see what happens, see what it looks like, right? And so I'll do that, I guess, here. And I'll copy a couple more line breaks in. Those over here. Saving, back to the browser to refresh. Let's make sure we're refreshed. And there's a choose a date thing. So you just click on it. If I click on the calendar, pretty slick. Okay. What did I code? All I coded was a regular input box, and I said type date, and it gives you one of those calendars. The next one's pretty cool too. You know, like how you know, we go to websites to pick colors and they give us hex codes and all that. You can invoke your system color picker by using this code. So I'm just going to throw that code in really quick too. Now, I don't know like where you might personally have a use for this, but I'm sure you'll think of one. Hey, maybe you're building somebody a car and they get to choose what color the car is. I don't know. Back to the browser, refresh. Now I can choose a color, and notice how it brings up a color picker, and I can get my hex code and everything. So, hey, wait a second. So I could make a website that has my own color picker. Yeah, you can totally do that. And notice how easy it is, you guys, right? It's crazy easy. Choose the date, choose the color. All right. Ultimately what they're telling us is that you have to practice with forms to get the stuff to look good, right? And I agree with that. And in the few minutes that we have left, I'm not going to have time to really style our form, unfortunately. But you can apply CSS to these. So here's my encouragement is I will try to style my form between this session and next session so you guys can see like the ugly form it is today and a nicer looking form the next time you come back, and then I'll post it up on my solutions page. But if you want help with styling your forms, what I would encourage you to do is watch the videos from the last time, or the most recent videos from the last time I did this lecture, and I do a whole lot of styling in there, and you can follow those styles. You can also, real frankly, go to my solutions page, and maybe this is probably the better tip, right? Is so we're okay, like the contact form here from when I did Last of Us from last time looks like this. So here's the form I built, right? And you see how I put it in a box, all my labels are inside. I mean, it's not like super fancy, but notice I did make the buttons green and red, that kind of stuff. So you could look at this, and once again, how did I get there? I went to my launch page, right? I went to unit 7 where I was doing the contact form, and you could look at contact forms from other semesters too, right? I'm not saying that what I created every time is beautiful. I just don't have enough time tonight to code through with CSS. But if you are looking at these pages, right, and you're looking at the contact form, and then you look at the code, right, and I did an inspect. I just want to do a view source, right? So I could look at the source here, look at the structure, and then go to the style sheet. And chances are I have all the table stuff, or excuse me, all the form stuff is probably all in the same area. And I'm looking for it right now. So look, I even labeled it for you, form styles. And then here's all the styles that are used to make it look the way that it looks. All right, folks, I'm going to cap this video here. So this video is now over.